to talk about the dominant 7 section of your chord palette. Now we're going to start with the straight dominant 7th chord, but in this category you can play a 9th, you can play a 13th. So just remember that you can add all of those tones and it will still be the Mixolydian sound. The next chord will be the dominant 7 sus4. Now this is also a Mixolydian sound. This is important to remember and learn that the Mixolydian sound is both a dominant 7 or a dominant 9 or a dominant 13 and a dominant 7 sus4. The next chord in your palette will be the dominant 7 sharp 11, otherwise known as the dominant 7 flat 5. Sometimes you'll hear it called both names. This will be the Lydian flat 7 mode. So your dominant 7 sharp 11 or dominant 7 flat 5. Now with this chord, you can also add a natural 9 to the sound or a 13 to the sound. The next chord in your palette is the altered dominant. So the altered dominant chord will be a sharp 5 or a sharp 5 and a sharp 9. What you need to think about with the altered dominant scale and the chord is that your 5 will be flatted and sharped, and your 9 will be flatted and sharp. So you'll have flat 5s, sharp 5s, flat 9s, sharp 9s. You can also think of it as flat 13 instead of sharp 5, for example. So there are different ways to talk about it, but your fully altered chord features the 5s and the 9s. That's how I think about it. And the next chord in your chord palette for dominant is the 13 flat 9. I refer to this as dominant diminished. It's a dominant chord, but the scale is a half whole diminished scale. So that's a big difference between the altered dominant and the dominant diminished. So it's important to make the distinction between those two sounds. The big distinction here is that the chord has a natural 13 instead of a flat 13. This is the altered, this is the dominant diminished or natural 13 flat 9. The scale also has a natural 5 in it, which is different than the altered scale. So let's talk about the scales. So if we play C7, if we play Mixolydian, C Mixolydian. It's important to recognize that on the sus4 chord, we're also playing the Mixolydian scale. It's the same scale as the regular dominant 7th chord. Now we're moving on to the Lydian flat 7 scale. So here's your Lydian flat 7. Moving on to the altered scale, this is going to be the scale. You can also think about this as a melodic minor up a half step. That's what a lot of players do. I like to think about it as both, so C altered or D flat melodic minor, but they're both very effective. And your C13 flat 9, this will be the half whole diminished scale. So you're going to start with a half step and you'll play the diminished scale. Make sure that you can play all of these scales along with the chord. One thing that players will typically do is learn a lot of scales, but they will not learn the chords that go along with the scale, the specific chords with the specific colors needed to describe the scale. So when you can do this, what I'm describing here, we can play that chord, play that scale. It's really great for your ear training and your basic fretboard knowledge for improvisation. Now I have a loop of the different chords in the dominant family. Now I'm going to comp along with them with different voicings. So here's a C13, a C9, C sus4. Just play with some different voicings. C7, sharp 11 with a 9, altered, and 13, flat 9. As discussed in the last video, now we're adding the next level of your palette. We're adding the dominant level. So now we need to play those chords along with a loop. We need to experiment with some different basic voicings. We need to play the scale along with this loop, playing every color of the dominant family. And then we need to improvise over all of the chords. And when you do this, like I mentioned in the first part of this, you'll find out pretty quickly what scales you know and what scales you don't know. And even if you know the scales, you'll also find out very quickly what scales you're comfortable with, what scales you have vocabulary, over, what scales you feel like you can get right to it and make some melodies.